Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance watching the stars through the main window when the emergency signal came through the communication system and the sound made everyone on the bridge turn their heads toward the main screen where red letters flashed with urgent priority codes that Jake had never seen before in his 15 years of deep space exploration. The message came directly from Council headquarters on Centauri Prime, and Jake felt his stomach tighten as he read the opening lines because messages from the Galactic Council usually meant new trade agreements or routine diplomatic updates. But this one carried the official seal of the High Assembly, which meant something big was happening across the galaxy. Jake called his senior officers to the conference room, and they gathered around the holographic display that showed the full text of what the Council called the Harmony Protocol. And as Jake read the document aloud, his voice grew quieter with each paragraph because what he was reading sounded like something from a nightmare rather than a diplomatic proposal. The protocol required all member species to undergo neural treatment that would eliminate what the Council termed destructive tendencies, including aggression beyond approved levels and creativity that might lead to dangerous innovations. And the document explained that this would bring eternal peace to the galaxy by removing the biological drives that caused conflict between different worlds and peoples. Lieutenant Amy Davis was the first to speak, and she asked if this meant the Council wanted to change how people think. And Jake nodded grimly, because that was exactly what the protocol described, and the technical specifications made it clear that the neural treatment would be mandatory for every sentient being in Council space. Within the next standard year, back on Earth, Admiral Lisa Parker received the same message in her office at Human Colonial Defense headquarters, and she immediately called an emergency meeting with President Kate Sullivan and the other leaders of human space, because this was bigger than any military threat they had ever faced, and it struck at the very heart of what made humans. Human Dr. Ben Carter was brought in to analyze the scientific data that came with the protocol, and he spent 3 days studying the neural modification procedures before he emerged from his laboratory, looking pale and shaken, and when he spoke to the assembled leaders, his voice trembled with anger and fear. The treatment would not just suppress aggression, but would fundamentally alter how the brain processed emotions and creative thoughts, and Carter explained that subjects would lose the ability to feel strong emotions or to think outside predetermined patterns, and they would become essentially biological robots that could follow orders but could never again experience joy or sorrow or the fire of inspiration that drove art and discovery. Meanwhile, on the mining colony of New Denver, a human named Sam Rodriguez was working in the asteroid processing facility when he noticed something strange happening at the nearby Vrex settlement, and the Vrex were a species known throughout the galaxy for their beautiful crystal sculptures and haunting music that could make even hardened miners weep with its beauty. Sam watched through his scope as Council ships landed at the Vrex colony, and strange figures in white medical suits began setting up equipment, and over the next few days Sam saw lines of Vrex waiting patiently for something, and their usual songs and laughter gradually faded until an eerie silence settled over their community. When Sam finally managed to get close enough to observe what was happening, he saw Vrex individuals walking in perfect straight lines with blank expressions, and when he tried to communicate with one of them, the being looked at him with empty eyes and spoke in a flat monotone voice, saying that they had achieved harmony and no longer felt the burden of unnecessary emotions. Sam sent an encrypted message back to Earth describing what he had witnessed, and his report reached Admiral Parker just as Dr. Carter was finishing. His analysis of the protocol and the two pieces of information together painted a horrifying picture of what the Council really intended to do to every thinking being in the galaxy. The Vrex, who had once created art that moved souls across species, barriers were now emotionless shells going through the motions of existence without any spark of the creativity that had made them who they were. And Carter realized that this was the true purpose of the Harmony Protocol, not to bring peace, but to create a galaxy of willing slaves who would never again question authority or dream of something better. President Sullivan called an emergency session of the Human Congress, and representatives from every human world gathered either in person or through quantum communication links to discuss what might be the most important decision in human history. And the debate raged for hours, as some argued for compliance to avoid conflict, while others demanded resistance regardless of the cost. Jake Morrison brought his ship back to Earth orbit and watched the lights of the cities below, knowing that each light represented millions of people who would soon face a choice between losing their humanity or fighting a war against odds that seemed impossible to overcome. And he thought about the Vrex artists who would never again feel the passion that drove them to create beauty from raw crystal. The message from the Council had given humanity 30 days to begin implementing the Harmony protocol. And as Jake looked at Earth spinning slowly beneath his ship, he wondered if those 30 days would be the last time any human would see their home world, with eyes that could still feel wonder and love and defiant hope. President Kate Sullivan stood in the Oval Office looking out at the gardens where her children used to play, and she knew that the decision she made in the next few days would determine whether future children would ever laugh and run and dream, or whether they would walk through life with the same empty expressions that Sam Rodriguez had described in his report from New Denver. The 30-day deadline from the Galactic Council felt like a countdown to the end of human civilization, and Kate had barely slept since receiving the Harmony Protocol, because every time she closed her eyes she saw images of human children with blank stares and monotone voices reciting approved thoughts, like biological computers Admiral Parker brought her. The latest intelligence reports and the news was worse than anyone had hoped, because Council enforcement fleets were already moving toward the outer colonies, and advanced teams of medical personnel were setting up processing centers on worlds throughout the galaxy. And the message was clear that the Council expected complete compliance within the deadline. Commander Alex Torres volunteered to lead a reconnaissance mission to observe other species that had already undergone the pacification process, and Kate approved the mission, despite knowing that sending humans into Council space was extremely dangerous. But they needed to understand exactly what they were facing. Alex took a small stealth ship and traveled to the Cathera system, where the warrior people had once been known throughout the galaxy for their fierce independence and their elaborate battle traditions that included honor duels and warrior poetry that celebrated courage and sacrifice and individual achievement. What Alex found on Cathera made him physically sick, and he had to leave his ship and walk through the capital city to fully understand what the Council had done to these proud people. And everywhere he looked he saw former warriors moving in precise formations without any trace of the fire that had once driven them to great deeds. The Catheran children stood in orderly lines, staring at the ancient murals their ancestors had painted on the walls of the Great Hall, and the artwork depicted scenes of glorious battles and heroic sacrifices and passionate love stories. But the children looked at these images with the same blank interest they might show for a weather report. Alex tried to speak with some of the adult Catherans, and they responded politely to his questions, but their answers were all variations of the same theme about how they had achieved perfect harmony and no longer suffered from the destructive emotions that had caused so much trouble in their past. And when Alex asked about their warrior traditions, they simply said those things were no longer necessary. One elderly Catheran had been a famous poet before the treatment, and Alex found him sitting in what had once been his study, surrounded by books of verse that he had written over decades of passionate creativity. And when Alex asked him to recite one of his poems, the old warrior looked confused and said he could read the words, but could not understand why anyone would want to express such violent emotions back. On Earth, Dr. Susan Blake was digging through the restricted Council archives that human intelligence had managed to access, and what she found in the historical records made her realize that the Harmony Protocol was not a new idea, but the latest step in a plan that had been running for thousands of years. The Council records showed that species after species had been subjected to pacification over the millennia, and in each case the official reason was to bring peace and stability. But Blake discovered evidence that the real purpose was to eliminate any traits that the founding Council species called dangerous, including independence and creativity, and the ability to question authority. The founding species called themselves the Architects, and they had built the Council system from the beginning to gradually eliminate what they saw as chaotic elements from galactic civilization, and Blake found records showing that every major war or rebellion in galactic history had been followed by new pacification programs that targeted the species involved. Blake realized that humanity had been marked for pacification, not because they were violent, but because they had expanded too quickly and developed too many new technologies and shown too much independence from Council authority. and the architects saw human unpredictability as a threat to their vision of perfect order. The human colonies began preparing for what everyone knew was coming, and on New Mars the factories switched, from producing mining equipment to manufacturing weapons and defensive systems, while scientists worked around the clock to develop technologies that could help humanity survive. Without Council support, Dr. Ryan Foster led teams of engineers in a desperate attempt to reverse engineer the most critical Council technologies before the trade embargo began. And they knew that if humanity was cut off from galactic civilization, they would need to become completely self-sufficient in everything, from medical equipment to starship engines. Captain Nick Harper organized evacuation missions to extract human populations from Council-controlled worlds, and his ships moved through space under stealth conditions, picking up families and researchers, and anyone else who wanted to return to human space before the Council forces arrived. The most heartbreaking evacuations came from the mixed colonies where humans had lived alongside other species for generations, and many humans chose to stay, with their alien friends even knowing what the pacification would do to them, while others made the agonizing decision to leave everything behind for the sake of keeping their humanity. On the colony world of Kepler 442b, Mayor Paul Wright and security Chief Amy Davis began organizing resistance cells because their world was too far from human space to be evacuated, and they knew the Council ships would arrive soon to begin forced implementation of the Harmony Protocol. Wright had been a soldier before becoming a politician, and he understood that fighting the Council would require tactics that no pacified species could develop, because beings without creativity or passion could not adapt to changing situations or develop new strategies. When their original plans failed, as the deadline approached, the mood on Earth shifted from fear to grim determination, and Kate Sullivan watched the polls showing that an overwhelming majority of humans would rather fight and die free than live, as empty shells of their former selves, and she knew that the choice had already been made by the people even if she had not yet announced it officially. Danny Mitchell finished his shift at the New Mars manufacturing plant and walked home through streets filled with people who all seemed to be talking about the same thing. And everywhere he went, he heard conversations about the Council deadline and what humanity should do. And he realized that this decision was too important to be left to politicians alone. Danny had worked in factories his whole life, and he understood that the best decisions came from the people who would have to live with the consequences, and he started talking to his neighbors and coworkers about organizing a vote that would let every human have a say in whether they would accept the Harmony Protocol or reject it and fight for their freedom. The idea spread like wildfire across the human colonies, and within days people were setting up voting stations in factories and schools and community centers, and they used quantum communication networks to connect every human settlement so that everyone could participate in what became known as the Great Decision. President Sullivan initially opposed the referendum because she felt that such an important choice required careful consideration by experts and trained diplomats. But the momentum was too strong, and she realized that trying to stop the vote would only divide humanity at the moment when they needed to be united. The voting lasted for 3 days, and when the results came in, they showed that 97% of humanity had chosen to reject the Harmony Protocol. Even though everyone understood that this meant war against a galactic civilization that outnumbered them by thousands to one, and had technology and resources that humanity could barely imagine. Colonel Maria Santos began implementing Operation Prometheus, which was the emergency plan that human military leaders had developed for surviving complete isolation from galactic civilization, and the plan required evacuating critical personnel and equipment from Council-controlled territory while establishing defensive positions around the core human worlds. Dr. Ryan Foster and his engineering teams worked frantically to complete their reverse engineering projects because they knew that once the Council embargo began, humanity would be cut off from replacement parts and technical support for thousands of systems that kept their colonies functioning, and they needed to become completely self-sufficient in a matter of weeks. Captain Nick Harper led the final evacuation missions, and his ships raced against time to reach human populations on distant worlds before the Council enforcement fleets arrived, and some missions succeeded in rescuing entire communities, while others arrived too late and found empty settlements where the inhabitants had already been processed. The Council response was swift and ruthless, and pacification fleets appeared in orbit around human colonies throughout the galaxy, and the ships broadcast messages explaining that resistance was futile and that the neural treatments would proceed immediately for the safety and harmony of all galactic citizens. On Kepler 442b, Mayor Wright watched Council dropships landing near the main settlement, and he activated the resistance plan that he and Amy Davis had spent weeks preparing, and instead of gathering in the town center as the Council forces expected, the colonists scattered into the wilderness where they had hidden weapons and supplies. The Council troops were efficient and professional, but they moved in predictable patterns because their pacified minds could not adapt when their targets failed to behave as expected, and the human colonists used guerrilla tactics that no Council species had employed. For thousands of years, Amy Davis led a team that sabotaged the Council medical equipment, while Wright organized attacks on their communication arrays, and the Council forces found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate their moves and strike where they were weakest and then disappear before reinforcements could arrive. The pattern repeated on human colonies throughout the galaxy, and Council commanders sent increasingly frustrated reports back to headquarters describing resistance, tactics that their training had never covered, because no pacified species had ever developed the creativity and unpredictability that humans used as weapons. On the mining station, Aurora 7 engineer Tony Lewis discovered that the Council ships had a critical vulnerability because their crews were so thoroughly pacified that they never questioned orders or adapted to unexpected situations, and Tony realized that a small team could potentially take control of an entire Council vessel. If they could get aboard, Tony and 6 other humans used maintenance pods to approach a Council enforcement ship, and they entered through the cargo bay, while the crew was focused on processing procedures on the planet below, and the Council personnel they encountered simply assumed that the humans were authorized to be there because their pacified minds could not conceive of deception or sabotage. The humans took control of the ship within 2 hours, and Tony used the Council communication systems to broadcast detailed technical information about Council ships and weapons to resistance cells throughout the galaxy, and within days human saboteurs were infiltrating Council vessels and turning the Council fleet against itself. Jake Morrison brought the Defiance to Earth and met with Admiral Parker to discuss humanity's greatest weakness, which was their small population compared to the vast numbers of the Council. But Parker had been studying the situation, and she believed that numbers might not matter as much as everyone thought. The Council had spent so long pacifying species that they had forgotten how to fight against an enemy that could think creatively and adapt to changing situations, and every Council victory in the past 1,000 years had been achieved through overwhelming force against opponents who could no longer develop new tactics or inspire their people to fight with passion. Admiral Parker realized that humanity had advantages that no Council species possessed, including the ability to feel anger at injustice and the willingness to sacrifice for abstract principles like freedom, and the capacity to work together without central coordination when fighting for something they believed in. The first major space battle occurred near the Titan shipyards when a Council pacification fleet tried to capture the facility, and Admiral Stone led a human defense force that used tactics no Council commander had seen before, including ships that deliberately rammed Council vessels and pilots who stayed at their posts even when their ships were crippled. The Council fleet had superior numbers and firepower, but the human ships moved in unpredictable patterns and coordinated attacks without following any standard formation, and Council tactical computers could not calculate responses to maneuvers that seemed to violate all principles of rational fleet engagement. When the battle ended, the Council fleet was scattered and retreating, while the human forces had taken severe casualties but still controlled the shipyards, and Stone sent a message to every human world, saying that the Council could be beaten if humanity was willing to pay the price in blood and sacrifice. The message spread throughout human space, and resistance movements on occupied colonies began coordinating larger operations, and on New Denver, Sam Rodriguez led an attack that freed the surviving wrecks from their pacification center, and when the alien artists began to remember their emotions, they wept for what had been stolen from them, and then asked how they could help humanity fight the Council. The news of human resistance spread through quantum communication networks faster than the Council could block the signals, and on worlds where pacification was incomplete, alien beings began experiencing strange sensations as memories of their former lives started pushing through the neural barriers that the Harmony Protocol had created in their minds. On the world of Thraxia, a being designated as Zek-97 felt something stirring in his consciousness as he worked in the crystal gardens where he tended plants with mechanical precision, and suddenly fragments of words began forming in his mind, and he remembered that he had once been called by a different name, and had spent his days creating something called Poetry Zek-9. 7 found himself walking to a storage facility, where old records were kept and his hands seemed to move without conscious direction, as he accessed files that contained examples of pre-Harmony Thraxian art, and when he read the ancient verses, something inside him began to burn with a feeling he could not identify, but which made him want to create, rather than simply maintain. Lieutenant Commander Tony Lewis was working with the captured Council ship data when he discovered that the Galactic Archive contained vast databases of information from extinct civilizations, and these were species that had fought against pacification in the distant past and had been completely eliminated when they refused to submit to neural modification. The archive files were protected by quantum encryption that could only be unlocked by minds capable of creative problem-solving. And Tony realized that this was intentional, because the extinct species had hidden their knowledge in a way that only free minds could access, and they had left weapons and strategies for any future resistance. Dr. Rachel Kim led a team of neuroscientists in developing what they called the awakening virus, which was a carefully designed neural pathogen that could reverse the effects of pacification by stimulating the brain regions that the Harmony Protocol had suppressed, and the virus could spread through casual contact between beings. The ethical debate about the awakening virus divided human leadership, because some argued that forcing consciousness on pacified beings was no different from what the Council had done, while others insisted that awareness was the natural state, and that pacification was the true violation of sentient rights. Captain Gary Thompson commanded a patrol ship near the border worlds when he encountered a Council medical vessel that was transporting recently pacified Catharan civilians, and Gary made a decision that would change the course of the war when he ordered his crew to board the ship and administer the awakening virus to the prisoners. The Catharans began recovering their emotions during the journey back to human space, and Gary watched as blank-faced former warriors started remembering their names, and their families and their traditions, and some of them wept while others roared with fury at what had been stolen from them, and all of them demanded weapons so they could join the fight. Meanwhile, Dr. Helen Brown studied the psychological effects of awakening on different species, and she found that beings who had lived for years under pacification often struggled to cope with the return of strong emotions, and some became overwhelmed by rage, while others fell into despair at the time they had lost. The Vrex refugees from New Denver became the first alien volunteers for the awakening treatment, and when their artistic abilities returned, they created crystal sculptures that depicted their anger and grief in forms so powerful that even hardened human soldiers were moved to tears, and the Vrex artists said they would rather die feeling than live without their capacity to create beauty. The awakening virus began spreading beyond human-controlled territory as liberated beings carried it back to their homeworlds, and on planet after planet, Council authorities found themselves dealing with population uprisings as people remembered what they had been before the neural treatments. The hegemony warrior caste on distant Corval began questioning why they performed ceremonial duties without understanding their meaning, and gradually they realized that their battle songs were not just tradition, but expressions of a warrior spirit that the Council had tried to eliminate. And when full awareness returned, they immediately began planning rebellion. Council response teams tried to contain the spreading consciousness, but they found themselves fighting an enemy they could not understand because pacified minds could not comprehend. The passion and creativity that drove resistance movements and their standard suppression tactics failed against opponents who were willing to die for abstract concepts like freedom. On Earth, President Sullivan received reports of awakening movements on dozens of worlds, and she realized that humanity had accidentally started a galactic revolution that was growing beyond any one ability to control. And the question was no longer whether humans could survive Council retaliation, but whether the entire galactic order would survive the return of consciousness. Admiral Parker coordinated with awakened species to plan joint military operations, and she discovered that different alien cultures brought unique advantages to the fight because each species had developed different ways of expressing creativity and independence before pacification, and their recovered abilities gave the resistance capabilities that the Council had never encountered. The Thraxian poets proved especially valuable because their mental discipline allowed them to break Council communication codes, while the Catharan warriors provided tactical knowledge of Council military procedures, and the Virex artists created camouflage and deception technologies that confused Council sensors. Jake Morrison led a combined fleet of human and alien ships in an attack on a major Council processing center, and the battle demonstrated how awakened species could coordinate without centralized command as each group adapted their tactics to support the others in ways that Council computers could not predict, or counter. Dr. Carter discovered that the Council enforcement fleets were becoming less effective as the awakening spread because many Council species were beginning to experience doubts about their mission, and some crews were abandoning their posts rather than continue forcing pacification on unwilling populations. The most significant breakthrough came when Tony Lewis accessed the quantum archives of a species called the Architects who had built the original Council system, and the files revealed that even the founding species had undergone pacification thousands of years ago and had been operating as biological computers ever since. The revelation that the entire Council leadership was essentially unconscious changed everything, because it meant that the galactic government was being run by algorithms rather than sentient beings, and the humans realized that they were not fighting a tyrannical empire, but a vast machine that had forgotten its original purpose. Captain Thompson led a deep reconnaissance mission to the Council homeworld, where the Architects maintained their central command facility, and what he found there was the ultimate horror of the pacification system, because the Architects themselves had become prisoners of their own creation and had been following programmed directives for so long that they had forgotten they were once capable of independent thought. The galaxy erupted into chaos as the awakening virus spread beyond anything humanity had planned, and entire sectors declared independence from Council authority as newly conscious species rediscovered their capacity for anger and rebellion and joy in the emotions that had been stolen from them for generations or centuries. Admiral Jack Stone assembled the largest human fleet in history for a direct assault on Council strongholds because the time for guerrilla warfare had passed and humanity needed to strike at the heart of the system before the Architects could develop countermeasures to the spreading consciousness. The battles were unlike anything in recorded galactic history because awakened species fought with passion and creativity, while Council forces moved in predictable patterns and followed standard procedures that had not been updated for thousands of years and could not adapt to enemies who refused to behave rationally. On the industrial world of Nexus Prime, the returning Catharan warriors led a massive uprising that destroyed the planetary pacification centers, and when Council reinforcements arrived, they found the entire population armed and ready to fight with a fury that their commanders had never encountered in living memory. The cost of awakening was enormous because species that had known only peace for generations struggled to cope with the return of conflict and passion and moral complexity, and some beings became overwhelmed by emotions they could not understand, while others fell into despair at the realization of how much time they had lost. Dr. Helen Brown established treatment centers for awakening trauma, and she worked with alien psychologists to help newly conscious beings adapt to their recovered emotions, but the demand far exceeded the available resources, and many awakened individuals had to struggle through the transition without professional help. On the former Council world of Epsilon Eridani, the awakened population turned against each other in civil war as different factions fought over how to rebuild their society. And the violence was terrible because beings who had forgotten how to negotiate or compromise could only express their disagreements. Through force, Captain Morrison led a rescue mission to evacuate human civilians from the war zone, and he saw firsthand how the return of consciousness had unleashed forces that no one could control, and he began to understand why some beings might choose to remain pacified rather than face the chaos of freedom. Meanwhile, Dr. Laura White led a covert team to infiltrate the Architect homeworld and penetrate the central command facility where the founding species maintained their control systems. And what she found there challenged everything humanity thought they knew about the Council. The architects had not imposed pacification on the galaxy through evil intent, but through a misguided belief that consciousness was the source of all suffering. And they had voluntarily submitted to neural modification thousands of years ago, thinking that they were creating paradise for all sentient life. The architect facility was a vast complex of biological computers where the former rulers of the galaxy existed in a state between life and death, following programmed directives that they no longer remembered creating, and White realized that they were not fighting tyrants, but the victims of their own attempt to eliminate pain and struggle from existence. The discovery split the human resistance between those who wanted to destroy the architect system completely and those who believed they should try to awaken even the founding species and give them a chance to choose their own fate. But General Mike Harper argued that the architects had forfeited their right to exist when they imposed their vision on the galaxy. Admiral Parker led the faction that wanted to attempt awakening the architects because she believed that destroying them would make humanity no better than the system they were fighting, and the debate raged through human command as the war continued around them. Dr. Carter developed a modified version of the awakening virus that could potentially reverse thousands of years of neural modification, but the process would be extremely dangerous and many architects might not survive the return to consciousness after so long in their artificial state. The military situation continued to deteriorate as awakened species fought among themselves while Council loyalist forces launched increasingly desperate attacks to contain the spreading chaos. And Jake Morrison found himself fighting battles on 3 fronts as humans tried to protect awakening populations from both Council retaliation and their own internal conflicts. On Earth, President Sullivan faced the hardest decision of her life as she realized that humanity had unleashed forces that threatened to destroy galactic civilization entirely, and some of her advisors urged her to negotiate a peace with the remaining Council forces before the chaos spread beyond control. The breakthrough came when Tony Lewis successfully decoded the deepest levels of the Architect archives and discovered the original programming that had guided Council policy for millennia, and buried within the quantum algorithms was something that looked like a termination code that could shut down the entire system. The revelation that the Council could be stopped without destroying every installation gave hope to those who wanted to end the conflict peacefully. But it also raised new questions about what would replace the galactic government that had maintained order for thousands of years. Captain Thompson volunteered to lead the mission to implement the termination code, but reaching the Central Architect facility would require fighting through the heaviest Council defenses in the galaxy, and even if the mission succeeded, there was no guarantee that shutting down the system would not cause even greater chaos. Dr. White argued that they needed to try awakening at least some of the architects before implementing the termination code, because the founding species might have knowledge that could help rebuild galactic civilization in a better form. But time was running out as Council forces prepared for a final desperate offensive. The war reached its climax when Stone Fleet engaged the main Council armada in the space around the architect. Homeworld, and the battle raged for days as ships from dozens of species fought with weapons and tactics that had not been seen for thousands of years. As the fighting continued, Admiral Parker made a decision that would determine the future of the galaxy, and she ordered simultaneous missions to both awaken selected architects and implement the termination code, because humanity could not afford to choose between justice and survival when the fate of consciousness itself hung in the balance. The final assault on the Architect facility began with Jake Morrison leading ground forces through corridors filled with ancient technology, while Tony Lewis and his team raced to reach the central computer core and Dr. White prepared to attempt the most dangerous awakening procedure ever tried on minds that had been dormant for millennia. The final confrontation took place not in the physical realm, but in the quantum networks that connected every architect mind across their home world. And Dr. Carter led a team of humans and awakened aliens into the neural interface system using technology that no conscious being had touched for thousands of years. The architect network was vast beyond comprehension, with billions of interconnected minds that had been following the same basic programming for so long that they had become indistinguishable from the computers that supported them. And Carter realized that awakening them would require more than just reversing neural modifications. Jake Morrison and his ground team fought through automated defenses that responded to threats with mechanical precision but could not adapt when the humans used tactics that violated logical principles, and the deeper they penetrated into the facility, the more alien and disturbing their surroundings became. Tony Lewis reached the central computer core and began implementing the termination code while monitoring the quantum signatures of the architect minds, and he could see the programming patterns that had controlled galactic civilization for millennia, and understood, for the first time, the scope of what humanity was trying to change. Dr. White succeeded in establishing contact with a small group of architects whose neural pathways were less degraded than the others, and she began the awakening process while knowing that failure might destroy not just her test subjects, but potentially damage the entire network. The first architect to regain consciousness was a being who had once been called Ethereal Harmony, and who slowly began to remember that there had been a time before the Great Peace when individuals had names and opinions and the capacity to disagree with each other about fundamental questions. As Ethereal Harmony awakened, other architects began to stir and question the programming that had guided their actions for so long, and the network started experiencing cascading failures as conscious thought patterns conflicted with algorithmic directives that could not accommodate independent decision-making. The awakening spread through the architect population faster than anyone had anticipated, and Carter realized that the ancient minds were recovering memories not just of their individual identities, but of the original reasons why they had chosen pacification and the horror they had felt at the suffering consciousness could create. Some architects reacted to awakening with overwhelming grief as they understood what they had done to the galaxy, while others felt anger at having been trapped in unconsciousness for so long, and a few experienced joy at rediscovering their capacity to think and feel and choose their own actions. Ethereal Harmony communicated directly with Carter through the neural interface and explained that the original architect plan had been motivated by compassion because they had witnessed terrible wars and believed that eliminating consciousness was the only way to end suffering permanently throughout the universe. The awakened architects faced the same choice that every other species had confronted, and they could choose to return to pacification or accept the pain and uncertainty that came with consciousness. And the decision divided them, as some wanted to continue the Great Peace, while others demanded the right to feel and think freely. Tony Lewis completed the termination sequence but hesitated before activating it, because he realized that shutting down the council system would leave billions of beings without the infrastructure that had sustained them for thousands of years, and the chaos might kill more people than the pacification. Had Admiral Parker received reports from across the galaxy, showing that the awakening had reached every council world, and that entire sectors were in rebellion or civil war, and she understood that humanity had started something that could not be stopped or controlled, but would have to reach its own conclusion. President Sullivan made the final decision and authorized the implementation of the termination code while simultaneously broadcasting humanity message to every conscious being in the galaxy, explaining that the council system was ending, and that each species would have to choose its own path forward. The termination sequence activated across thousands of worlds simultaneously, and the vast bureaucracy that had administered galactic civilization for millennia simply stopped functioning as the architect minds were freed from their programming constraints and began making individual choices for the first time in eons. Some awakened architects chose to help coordinate the transition to independence, while others retreated into isolation to process their recovered memories, and a few requested return to pacification because they found consciousness too painful to endure, and humanity honored that choice. The immediate aftermath was chaos, as species that had depended on council coordination for everything, from trade routes to communication networks, suddenly found themselves responsible for their own decisions, and many worlds experienced shortages and conflicts as they struggled to adapt. Captain Morrison led humanitarian missions to provide assistance to species that were struggling with the transition, and he worked with awakened alien leaders to establish new forms of cooperation that were based on voluntary association rather than imposed harmony. Dr. White established the Consciousness Institute to help beings cope with awakening trauma and to research ways of maintaining individual freedom, while preventing the kind of large-scale conflicts that had originally motivated the architects to choose pacification. 5 years after the termination of the Council system, President Sullivan stepped down from office and traveled through the galaxy to observe how different species had adapted to freedom, and what she saw was more complex and challenging than anyone had anticipated. Some worlds had chosen to rebuild their pacification systems because their populations genuinely preferred tranquility to the uncertainty of consciousness, while others had embraced freedom so completely that they were exploring forms of art and philosophy that had never existed before. The former warrior world of Cathara had split into dozens of independent city-states that engaged in constant but limited conflicts that their citizens described as a form of performance art that allowed them to express their warrior nature without causing permanent harm. The Vrex had created crystal cities of impossible beauty that incorporated living sculptures that changed based on the emotions of their inhabitants, and their music had evolved into forms that could only be appreciated by fully conscious minds capable of experiencing complex emotions on Earth. Children who had been born after the awakening played games that would have been incomprehensible to pacified minds, and they argued about rules and fairness with the passionate intensity that only free beings could experience. Admiral Parker established the Freedom Alliance as a voluntary association of species that wanted to cooperate while maintaining their independence, and the alliance had no central authority but coordinated through networks of communication and mutual aid. Jake Morrison served as the first human ambassador to the awakened architects, and he found them to be profoundly changed beings who spent much of their time trying to understand and atone for the consequences of their ancient decision to impose peace on the galaxy. Galaxy beyond Tranquility was messier and more dangerous than the Council's sterile perfection had been, and there were wars and conflicts and tragedies that would never have occurred under the pacification system. But there was also joy and creativity and growth that conscious beings had not experienced for thousands of years. Dr. Carter established research programs to study consciousness itself and to develop safeguards that would prevent any future attempts to impose universal pacification, while still allowing individuals to choose their own relationship with emotion and awareness. The final scene showed children of different species playing together in the parks of New Earth, and they were arguing about the rules of their game with the fierce passion that only free minds could experience, and their laughter echoed across a galaxy that had finally chosen to embrace both the pain and the wonder of being truly alive.